I'm here on the banks of the Willamette River, right outside the OMSI Museum, recording a segment for an upcoming video. I picked this spot because it's nicely framed between the two bridges. It's kind of a cool spot by the waterfront. And I recorded this segment talking about salmon on the Snake River dams, having no idea that there's a display right here with a bunch of misinformation about the Chinook salmon. The display starts with some good background about indigenous history. It acknowledges that development of the river previous to the construction of the dams had an effect, but it kind of skims over it a little bit. For some reason, it specifically calls out Detroit Dam, which is not a particularly large watershed. Not sure why they picked that one. It seems to have a thing about hatcheries. It says that they were built to compensate for adverse effects of dams, but then it overwhelms natural systems and endangered native runs. This is a very controversial hot take. There's a lot of arguments within the industry about this. I've not met two fishery biologists who agree on this subject. On one hand, it's entirely possible that the development of hatchery stocks have pushed out the quote-unquote wild fish from their dominance on the river. That is possible. It's also entirely possible that the decline of the wild runs was happening already, and the hatchery fish are the only thing that's saved that species from extinction. I've seen fishery biologists get into literal fights over this issue, because the stakes are crazy high. If you were to remove the hatchery fish and the wild stocks did not rebound, you just lost the species. But on the other hand, if the hatchery fish are outperforming the wild fish, isn't there some lessons to be learned about that? There's nothing stopping us from taking the genetic material of hatchery fish and intermingling it with the wild, especially if that improves survivability. But here's where this display really messes things up. This part right here. Native salmon populations in the Willamette have been shrinking for the past century. No, they've been shrinking for the last century and a half. Historic spring Chinook salmon runs are estimated at 200,000 to 300,000 fish. We have no way of actually verifying how many fish were there pre-colonial times. It's a reasonable guess, but it's not data. In 1996, the estimated wild Chinook salmon run was 2,000 to 3,000 fish, 100 times less. This is the critical piece of information that they're leaving out. Although it doesn't come right out and say it, this display kind of implies that decline happened in the last 40 years. It didn't. By and large, the collapse of the historic Pacific Northwest salmon runs happened between 1880 and 1920. We know this because we've seen the volume of material that was being pulled out of the river during those decades, not to mention the pollution that was being sent downstream during the Industrial Revolution. By the time we actually started counting the fish after World War II, the historic runs were long since gone. And displays like this make it seem like that happened fairly recently. It's just not true. What could you do to save water for fish? Sweep, don't hose. Use irrigation. This is funny because not only are none of those water conservation techniques going to have any effect on any salmon habitat, but we're downstream of all that. This is the Willamette River. It's practically at sea level. No amount of water conservation in Portland is going to affect any habitat upstream. Our choices help or hinder salmon recovery. What could you do to use less energy? I mean, sure, maybe, like if it's 1976 and there's an Arab oil embargo and an energy crisis and gas lines, I guess some of those things might make a difference, but not for fish. Also, you don't get to choose where your power comes from. That's how a grid works. It all just kind of goes into the same pot. Some utilities will charge you more if you want to use green energy, but it's all coming out of the same spigot. Anyway, nothing against OMSI. It's actually a really cool place, and especially if you have young kids, this place is awesome. Just, check sources, read a little deeper.